My name is Sabir Sazay. I'm the Chief Executive of Scottish Refugee Council. Today we gather to discuss a crucial and ongoing challenge, one that requires our collective action, commitment and unwavering determination. Sadly, the context we currently live through, it seems like we're going in the opposite direction. Racism and oppression are prevalent at all levels. And in some spheres of our society, it has become a commonplace, from social media to our streets, to our neighborhood, to our schools, workplaces, and supermarkets. In our work at Scottish Refugee Council, we see systemic racism in the form of the UK's asylum system. The multi-protection schemes for people fleeing similar atrocities, wars, conflicts, and human rights violations, and the expectation for people to survive on £1.60 a day in this current cost of living crisis is one of the many examples. Racism in any form undermines the very fabric of our society and hampers the potential for peaceful coexistence, cohesion, unity, growth, and equality. Colleagues, it is therefore our shared responsibility to create a Scotland where every individual, regardless of their race or ethnicity, feels valued, respected, and empowered. And to achieve that very important vision, our panel for today's discussion comprises distinguished experts, advocates, and community leaders who have dedicated themselves to this important cause. So let's get started. So I'll start off with Talat, closest to me here, for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you to SVO and Open University for the invitation today, and thank you to you all for being here. It will come as no surprise, I would say, to anybody who is certainly on this panel and in the audience that I think we live in dangerous political times. And those dangerous political times are not just what's going on in America. It's not just what's going on in France or Italy. It is what's happening here in the UK and has been happening here for a number of years, and yes, here in Scotland too. It's important that we recognise that we're not immune to the realities of what's going on, of the rise of populism, the rise of far-right racism and fascism across the world. We are seeing the rollback of hard-won rights, and we were already not sufficiently working hard enough to have those rights. We are rolling back on progress that was not fully made in the first place. If anything, it illustrates a little bit of just how surface level some of that progress has been when it has been so easily rolled back in some cases. In Scotland here, I think we sometimes have a sense of immunity from what is happening elsewhere. In fact, what tends to happen is we're just a little bit later in what is happening elsewhere. And I think we see that in some of the other areas of inequalities that some of you may be working in. All of the work that many of you will be doing is related to poverty and inequality. It's related to the politics of the day. We can't choose to disassociate ourselves from those realities. It is one and the same in the work that we do. So when we opt to not participate in politics, actually we're opting not to do the work that we have signed up to create a more socially just society, Scotland and beyond. And one of the ways in which that so-called immunity or difference that was in Scotland came to the fore for me was over summer, when you'll remember we had the racist riots in England. And I had two different media outlets contact me and ask me to discuss why I think that's not happening in Scotland. Now, whilst that in itself did not happen in Scotland, it did not mean that racism wasn't happening in Scotland, that it wasn't illustrating itself in different ways in Scotland. And what seems to have been forgotten was just, I think, 8 months before that, we had a far-right racist rally that became violent outside of a hotel in Scotland that was housing vulnerable asylum seekers. So we are not immune to it, and we need to be aware of this and responsive to it. As somebody who has the privilege of being a consultant and a social researcher, I've had the opportunity to work with a whole host of organisations and community organisations in Scotland and indeed across the UK. And those of us who've been working in this space have been talking about this for a long time. In fact, the communities that are most likely to be targeted, who are most vulnerable to this, communities of Black and communities of colour, migrant communities, asylum-seeking communities, Muslim communities, have been advocating for us to fight back for a long time. It's a bit like the frog in the boiling water. This hasn't happened overnight. This has crept in continuously over recent years. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, have we sufficiently responded? And I think we know the answer to that. It was a rhetorical question, really. As a consultant and the privilege that I have with those conversations, there's three themes that I have recognised across the third sector and organisations that I've had the privilege to work with. And I want to share that with you here because the purpose of us having this panel is not just to describe the problem because we do too much of that, it's to do something about the problem. It's to feel empowered enough to take responsibility for the space that we occupy. Sometimes this can feel like a very big issue and perhaps we opt out of it because it feels too big. But if we all take responsibility for the space in community and society we occupy, that starts to link together and create a tipping point of change. So the kind of three key themes that have come out from a number of years now of doing this work. The first is the notion of the third sector and the voluntary sector. I've always found it really interesting that we refer to ourselves as a sector. And I think what has happened with that is over years is the professionalisation of that sector. In response to ongoing austerity in our community, many of us have become more and more service delivery than some of the perhaps proactive work that we signed up for at the beginning. We're responding to mitigating state failure by doing more and more service delivery to fill the gap. So we've become more of a sector, but really what we need to be is more of a movement. A collective, joined-up movement that pushes back against the inequalities that we see in policy making, in resource sharing, in what is asked of us and whose line it is we're asked to take when we're applying for whatever 6 month to 1 year funding we can manage to find. Many of the conversations I'm having is about how we move from sector to movement. What does that look like? How do we do more of that? What is that in reality and how do we change the way we work? The second is, while I do not deny the good intentions of the sector/movement, still making up my mind as to what to call us, I do not question the good intention of it, but in the time that I've been working in this space, we're stuck in having discussions and training when it comes to anti-racism. We will do awareness-raising training, we will do strategic training, we will do Black History Month events, we will do a statement in support. The rhetoric, the training and skills building is welcome. What I haven't seen enough of is that translate into strategic planning, resource allocation, prioritization and change in the way that we work. The skilling up is necessary, but the next step of skilling up into change making and delivery, we're a step behind there. And we seem to be stuck a little bit in a loop of training ourselves up for this issue rather than moving into the issue itself. And thirdly and finally, a lot of my work is about intersectionality. Intersectionality, and for those of you who know me, yes, I'm saying this again, intersectionality is about understanding how multiple oppressions compound and exacerbate the situation and the inequality and oppression that certain communities face. I stand in front of you as somebody who experiences sexism, somebody who experiences racism, somebody who experiences Islamophobia as a Muslim woman of colour. There is not one issue that anybody in this room is working on that is siloed. No matter how our funding streams work, no matter what service delivery we pursue, it's not siloed. The issue of anti-poverty and classism, of racism, of sexism, of disability discrimination, of homophobia and transphobia, these are oppressions that lean on each other to survive. They are interconnected, and therefore our response on anti-poverty has to be interconnected. Because if we only focus on one, we are indirectly enabling another. So we have to be responsive to an intersectional way of working. That means anti-poverty with anti-racism, anti-poverty with anti-racism and anti-disability discrimination. It's tackling sexism within that. It sounds difficult, but it's not, because actually if we think about lived experience expertise, which we talk about a lot, people are experiencing these things overlapping all of the time. So it's our duty to respond in that way. We need to take responsibility for the space we occupy. And all I would leave you with is the mental image of what would happen when all those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle came together and we took responsibility for the space we occupy. We would challenge and change society a lot faster. I look forward to hearing your questions and discussing this with you further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. Those were really challenging and insightful. And I think what we need to take away, for me particularly, is that move from a sector to movement. And I think we do need that movement and common solidarity to overcome some of the challenges that we face. So, Leila, Roxanne, for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Oh, that was a loud laugh. Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Tala, and everyone else who's here today. I'm just going to share some thoughts. I think, as Talat said, there's not probably much that I can offer that we maybe don't already know. We're part of a society that's in denial and that is always defensive. It wasn't me, it wasn't us, we aren't like that here. We're part of a society where some people welcome refugees, but we don't question or think about imperialism. We don't think about settler colonialism, and we don't think about the exploitation which creates the environments which are so hostile that people are forced to leave their homes, lives, and histories. We also don't question or think about the conditionality of being a refugee, a migrant, or the other trying to live here. We live in a society where we're expected to get over something pretty quickly, or fight for years to have our lives turned inside out in order to receive acknowledgement of injustice or some small sense of justice. And we've seen this with the inquiries into the Hillsborough disaster, the post office scandal, Grenfell, Stephen Lawrence, the Battle of Orgreaves, most recently Spy Cops, and the ongoing public inquiry into the death of Jacob Bio here in Scotland. In each, we have learned of police brutality, cover-ups, surveillance, abuse, threats, false media reporting. We live in a society of superficiality and spectacle, which can produce many papers, many policies, audits, consultants, CEOs, campaigners, strategies, and well-intentioned statements on racism and anti-racism, which can quote radical voices and terms until they come to mean nothing, where we scroll past a jarring mix of people having nice lives and people living through genocides and war. Civic society, institutions and individuals are part of that society. They don't stand above or beside it. So what would happen if all this resource went into doing the work which could offer alternatives, and in doing so makes unsustainable the economic and social system which creates conditions of harm, disregard and isolation? Conditions which allow fascism, violence and hate to thrive. In the last few years, I've cried whilst watching and listening to far-right groups hold significant crowds in Erskine and in Elgin. In Dunoon, I've reassured my grandmother when far-right leaflets appeared through her letterbox. In Glasgow, where I live, I've come across graffiti with far-right symbols and anti-black graffiti. Now, speaking about denial and defensiveness, when I've raised this with peers, this is often dismissed as, just children playing around, not really knowing what it means. But these words and symbols and beliefs have been normalised, and this is something that we need to acknowledge and hold ourselves accountable for. Last year, when it was always expected that a far-right rally would take place in George Square in Glasgow, I'm quite nosy. So I studied the event page in the lead up to the event. And people were keen to attend and make a stand against immigration, against perceived taking of resources. Some of these comments were by people I went to university with, family, friends, not just I think people like to say it's the Daily Mail crowd or, the Sun reading crowd, but it can be Guardian readers, it can be Financial Times readers, as much as anybody else. One thing I did notice is the Scottish crowd wanted to distinguish themselves from the violence down south, to be family friendly, to be more dignified, to be taken more seriously in their demands. There's even Scottish exceptionalism in our fascism and racism. There have been counter-responses to these demonstrations, and this has oftentimes been led by community members and trade unionists. And the Scottish Trade Union Congress, for those of you that don't know, is the National Trade Union Centre in Scotland. It represents over 540,000 workers in Scotland. Were instrumental in calling a public meeting in Erskine within the first days of us becoming aware that the far right were planning to organise outside of the hotel in Erskine. And they've been instrumental in organising counter-demos and resources. Trade unions don't just work to negotiate better working conditions for people, they also work to change social conditions for people. And I'm sure many of you here are familiar with the Napasaran story. But these beliefs haven't gone away, and they never did. They just exist elsewhere at present. And the work that we need to do goes beyond demonstrations. And though these have a place, and especially now with anti-protest legislation starting to creep into society, the work is in our communities and where we spend time with people offline and online. So where do we go and what do we do? We need to be working from a place of possibility, a place of healing, a place of creativity, a place of adaptation, of risk and of hope. This means talking about race, class and gender, about disability justice, about LGBTQIA justice. This means talking about imperialism, colonialism and capitalism. How can we share and use our resources to build infrastructures which don't currently exist in our mainstream? Infrastructures of care, belonging, nourishment and love. Sufficiency, not suffering. If you're working in an organisation which campaigns or advocates or provides services, think about the people you work for. Think about the people who you work for's need that's beyond your understanding. That's the point in which you should be working from. This means becoming politicised. Being and becoming politicised means learning about the world as it is. How did it come to be this way? It's going to take loving corrections. Judging, shaming, humiliating, and trying to control people isn't how these things work. This is going to take work. It's going to take collective work, which is long and often frustrating and sometimes very, very, very dull, and sometimes has very poor coffee. And you might not see the changes that you want to see in your lifetime, or indeed in the lifetime of the project in which you've been funded for. But sometimes I think we try so hard to look and work for a fix or a success in order to move on to the next thing and the next thing, that we don't really see what was successful. Success then maybe can be framed as creating and supporting the space for trust and meaningful connections to be re-established. Success is offering options, safety and support for our collective liberation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leila Roxanne. I think the point around the culture of denial and disbelief, I think, is an important one, especially around the refugee communities and people looking for safety. But again, really, really helpful and important points. So thank you. Fidel, your opening remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I would like to start by thanking my colleagues at the Open University in Scotland, who actually thought I might be able to contribute something to this event. I don't live in Scotland. I have to make a few concessions. In fact, the last time I was in Edinburgh was in 2011, I think. So I had a good experience, and I was on holidays, and now I'm back. But I bring with me the experience I accumulated in the voluntary sector in the Republic of Ireland for more than 19 years, but also in the UK in the last 11 years also. And I also bear in mind the fact that the voluntary sector, when I moved to Ireland in particular, humanized me when society was at the time dehumanizing me. And I feel very strongly about the voluntary sector and what it has to do to help people who can't speak, whose voices are suppressed, because there's nobody else there for the refugees, for the asylum seekers, for ethnic minorities, and so forth. Obviously, people expect, you go and you get your job and you get on with it. Far from it. So when you are isolated, when you are disconnected, the glue which should help us to settle in, to engage, is actually the voluntary sector. And I can't underscore it more than what I'm doing at the moment. So going back to the issue at stake today, as it happens, I was just checking social media earlier, and I realized that this is Race Equality Week. We are actually on day number 2. And the theme of the week is actually every action counts. So it's very easy to look at those things like racism, intolerance, Islamophobia, homophobia, and look at them as if they are distant. The question is, what do? You at a personal level. Yes, the voluntary sector can help us to organize, but we as individuals, we have to take responsibility. If we don't, who else will? And one of my heroes, I got a chance to meet him a while back, is the late Congressman John Lewis. I think he was the closest to Martin Luther King I came across. And what he said was that we should not be afraid to engage in what he called good trouble. And that's what I've been doing over the last while. I don't accept the status quo. I don't see things happening and say I can't do anything. I try my best. I can't save the world, but I can help one person. And I think if at the end of the day, when we finish, that's the action we take, is to go and do something small for one person, I think it would be terrific. So, I don't know if you recall what happened in 2020. Seems like a long time ago. But I tell you what I remember about 2020. Of course, I remember COVID. And I remember the disproportionate impact it had on ethnic minorities. I also do remember that instead of looking at the problem, we assumed it was to do with vitamin D. I don't know how many of us went out looking for vitamin D complements to see if we could be saved from the pandemic. While that one was taking place, we also had the murder of George Floyd. It was too far away, but obviously the messages from the Black Lives Matter in the US resonated with our experiences here. And I could not help but to observe what was happening. I have been an activist for a long time, but I don't think I have ever used what they call direct action, such as the pulling down of the Colston statue in the harbor of Bristol. While this was happening, something else was happening, which was the NHS, the police, the councils were trying to engage with people in order to speak to the so-called hard-to-reach communities. I don't think anybody's hard to reach. Mm-hmm. If you know somebody exists, they are not hard to reach. Could we maybe say easy to ignore? Yeah, I'm just trying to think. So what I'm saying is there was this urge by everybody to go and set up advisory committees And we were in high demand, I have to say. I don't remember how many people were trying to get a small piece of me. But what I know is it's very easy to go and look for people who are high profile, who have high political capital. But I cannot pretend that being black, for example, entails having the experiences of every black person in the UK. That's where we talk about intersectionality. If I live in a particular neighborhood, have a particular job, I'm probably going to get away with it. And a few people will assume because we have people, black, brown on the panel, in our cabinets, everything is hunky-dory. Particularly if those people are willing to go out and do the bait and literally pretend everything is fine. And that's what I've been trying to stand against. So as a consequence of COVID, Black Lives Matter and the whole debate, I worked with a few colleagues and a few voluntary sector organizations, some funders, to develop a program which we started calling a Black Leadership and Empowerment Program. We actually did run a pilot in Manchester last year with a view of creating new leaders from the voluntary sector who can step in instead of going always to the usual suspects. I'm pleased to say, so we are not making a formal announcement yet, but we are starting the program in the 4 nations. In fact, our hub in Scotland is in Glasgow. So I'll be visiting Glasgow at least 3 times between now and the end of October. So what I'm trying to say is we need to help people speak for themselves. We cannot rely on the usual suspects, because if we do it, we'll hear the same story and we'll encourage people who are self-serving, self-appointed, to be representatives of those communities. So the more leaders we have, and the more the voluntary sector can help us, the better, because it has been going on for a long time and we cannot just maintain the status quo. And finally, obviously, I would like to stress and underscore the individual responsibility, which I have alluded to. Anti-racism is everybody's business. It's not the business of the victims. In fact, we will remember, as Martin Luther King said, the people who stayed silent when things were hard. So what are we doing today to deal with those issues? There's nobody else but, obviously, we, me, you. And finally, and I stop here, we have also to think about the trauma which goes with standing up against the issues we are talking about. In 2012, I was called a promoter of white genocide, simply for taking a stand and engaging in anti-racism. Thank you very much.